First of all, would like to start my talk with thanking the organizers for having invited me. Before that presentation, I also had a week here in which I taught a course on hidden complexity, hidden and overt complexity, so on complexity in general. I enjoyed that very much. And I said that I'm very happy to have the chance to be here and to exchange ideas. Now, this talk summarizes up to a certain extent what I've said before, but it also brings in probably some new aspects. What I would like to start with is that I would like to start with two types of complexity that we can find in the world's languages, and these two types are based on what is called the articulatory bottleneck, as you can see on this handout, and I hope that meanwhile everybody has a handout. What is the articulatory bottleneck? The articulatory bottleneck is the problem that you have to produce sound, and producing sound and perceiving and analyzing sound, that is the transmission rate that is associated with sound, is a very, very slow process in comparison to pre-articulation, parsing, and comprehension. The human comprehension and the human parser is much quicker, and our ability to infer is much quicker, needs much less time than actually articulating and producing sound. And then there is this saying by Levinson 2000, inference is cheap, articulation is expensive. Now, if we see it from that perspective, there seem to be two forces operating in language. One of them has to do with explicitness and articulation. But as I said, articulation is expensive. So we have, on the other hand, inference, which is cheap, and inference is based on economy. You say as much as you have to, but of course you economize, you don't investigate into too much effort. So we have these two competing motivations, which are famous. Even von der Gabelens in 1891 coined the two nice German terms, Deutlichkeitstrieb versus Bequemlichkeitstrieb, that is the instinct for explicitness, which is Deutlichkeitstrieb, and the instinct for laziness, which is the Bequemlichkeitstrieb. And then, of course, later on, Heyman in 1983, iconic versus economic, and in optimality theory in general, we have these two principles of faithfulness and markedness constraints which matter. Now, if one looks at these two competing motivations, they produce different types of output, different type of results in terms of complexity. Explicitness and articulation produces overt complexity, as you can see from figure 1, and economy, pragmatic inference, produces what I call hidden complexity. What are the manifestations of these two types of complexity? You can see that at the bottom of the first page, overt complexity. In overt complexity, the speaker is forced to overtly express certain grammatical categories, so it's about obligatoriness, that is one side of the phenomenon. And the other one is that it provides a rich inventory of, as we will see, fine-grained grammatical categories. On the hidden side of complexity, on the other hand, there is no obligatoriness, so the language doesn't force the speaker to overtly express a certain grammatical category, even though, and that is important, the language actually has a marker for expressing this kind of concept. So not everything is just hidden in the sense everything you could potentially may infer is hidden, but the language needs to have a system in which, for instance, you are obliged or not obliged to express tense. In the case of hidden complexity, the language then would have a tense system, but speakers are not forced into using it if it's clear from context what is meant and where to situate a certain event. This is one side, lack of obligatoriness, and the other side, under Roman 2 economy number B, there are multifunctional markers whose concrete meaning must be inferred from context. So these are the two sides of complexity and their consequences in terms of structural properties. And probably the most striking consequence of hidden complexity is, and that leads me to the bottom of page 2, we get simple-looking surface structures, as for instance in 1A versus 1B. So in 1A from Chinese you have you, yesterday, see, film, question marker. So 你昨天看了电影吗? Did you see a film yesterday? And then the answer is 看了. this is a pretty simple surface structure. You have just can see and a perfective marker, and you have to infer the two arguments of can. So the structure looks simple on the surface, but there is a lot of inferential work to be done by the hearer. That is the basic situation. Now let's briefly look, before we go on, at some examples of first explicitness and then economy. So Roman 1a on the handout, about explicitness and obligatoriness, I probably don't need to say too much about that. In many languages there are grammatical categories that have to be uttered, say in a declarative clause. With English you would have to mark tense in one way or another, you would have to mark number, indefiniteness, and so on. In other languages you have evidentiality or politeness. To give you a short idea of what I mean by rich inventory of fine-grained grammatical categories, the second part, let's look at the pronominal system of Fiji. Pronominal systems can be less or more complex. This one is an example of a rather more complex one, because you have a singular, a dual, a trial, and a plural. And then in that case, in the case of the first person, you see the distinction between inclusive and exclusive. And then, of course, second and third person analogously. So you get a relatively complex, fine-grained pattern of markers. And if you want to address person, if you want to use a personal pronoun, then of course you have to select among these. Or another famous example is evidentiality in Tariana, an Amazonian language from Brazil, in which it's not possible to omit information on evidentiality in the main clause. So under 2, we basically have the same event, namely Jose has played football, but then depending on the source of information from which the speaker draws that information differs. So in the case of visual evidentiality, I've seen him playing football, you use 2a, di manica ka, with visual evidentiality. Non-visual evidentiality, for instance, you heard him, so you would have Jose has played football, and I heard the noise in the village, so I know he played. Or inferred evidentiality, I didn't see him, but I saw his dirty shoes or something like that, so he must have played it. Assumed evidentiality and reported evidentiality annually from this. And then on the other hand, if we move to the economic side, there's lack of obligatory categories in Eastern Main and Southeast Asian languages. You have, for instance, pronominal system, but you don't need to use it if the situation is clear. You have tense aspect marking, but you don't have to use it. And you have to use, is a definiteness marking system, but you don't have to use it. I've given you 2 examples, one from modern Chinese and the other one under 4 from Khmer. We probably just look at number 4 from Khmer. This is about a husband and his wife who had to hide her lover in a pitcher somewhere. So it's a dramatic story. The lover is in the pitcher, suffers there, and let's see what happens. As you can easily see, there is no tense aspect marker in the first line. They, husband, get up. Da, walked away from the center of interest. Lifted a bucket of water. And you can see the subject is never marked here. So there's the verb walk and go, which has no subject. There's the verb lift. A bucket of water, again, no subject. Then there is, as I said, there is no tense aspect marking there. You can look at line 1 as long as you want to, you won't find one. And the same happens to line 2. So after the husband lifted the water bucket, he took it, no subject marking again, pour on lover inside pitcher, so he poured it onto the lover inside the pitcher. Again, no marking of the subject. And then we have slapdo, died. Again, no marking of the subject, but of course the one who died was not the husband, who was throwing the hot water on the poor guy in the pitcher, but it was the one in the pitcher who then actually died. And there is, as you can see, there is no topic continuity or something like that. 0 is 0, and you have to infer in each case who might be the actor. And if there is a subject change, you also have to infer. So what one can see from this example, to make it simple and short now, is there's a lot of radical pro-drop, in the sense that you cannot retrieve the argument even from agreement. You drop tense aspect marking, and there's also no number marking and almost no definiteness marking in this example. So obligatority or lack of obligatority is, as I said, one side of hidden complexity, and the other side is the existence of multifunctional markers. I quote this example, which I've already quoted in SONORA last year, so I make it very short. Verbs with a meaning of 1 to have can have at least 4 different interpretations in Eastern and Southeast Asian languages. So they can mean be able to, in the sense of ability or permission. They can mean obligation, have to, must. They can mean past. And they can also mean, point out the factuality of an event. And under 6, which is a constructed example, at Bandobsa, you can see that this can mean, depending on context, he was able to go to the market, he did go to the market, in the sense it's a fact that he went there, and he went to the market in the sense that he did that action in the past. Okay, this is just a short introduction into how complexity manifests itself in the hidden form. Now, what I didn't explain last time, and what is more recent, and also as far as my own development is going, is that the two processes of complexity, hidden and overt, are independent of each other. That is, there is no trade-off relation between them. Very often in typological circles, the idea is that if something is unexpressed, or if a language is somehow less complex in one way or another, then it is compensated in another way. But there is no compensation going on. The two competing motivations operate, and they produce different results. So my first hypothesis is, as I said, there is no trade-off relation between hidden and overt complexity. So if you look at table 1, and if we change that into a tetrachoric table as that one, distinguishing between 2 parameters or 2 values for hidden complexity, you have a high degree of hidden complexity and a low degree of hidden complexity. And on the other hand, you also have a high degree of overt complexity and a high degree of low degree of overt complexity. That yields you 4 different fields, and well, 3 of them can be filled. They're, of course, always based on concrete examples and concrete markers. One would, for instance, situate English in the field of low hidden complexity, because it has no pro-drop, it has obligatory tense, and it has to mark number. But it also has high overt complexity, because it has quite a number of rather intricate, fine-grained expressions, grammatical expressions and distinctions. On the other hand, I list Creole languages, at least the ones I discussed last time in SONORA, so I will also not be very providing abundant list of examples here. So many Creoles, and first of all the ones with West African and Germanic or Romance contact, they first of all do not have so many fine-grained distinctions. That's why I situate them in the low hidden complexity department. But on the other hand, for instance, in most of the Creoles I'm mentioning here, there is no radical pro-drop. So pronouns have to be there. There are no zeros. And quite a few other examples, also tense aspect markers, for instance, have to be there. So in that sense, they have their hidden complexity is not very high, even though the inventory and the of different distinctions is low too. So you have them in that department. And what is now interesting and what proves, and what I will try to prove by example, is the case of East and Mainland Southeast Asian languages, because in these languages, as you've seen, there is a high degree of hidden complexity, but on the other hand, they also show a lot of grammaticalization processes which need time for development. So in fact, these languages are plus in two ways. They are plus hidden and plus overt. And that is a special case and shows, in my view, that there are no trade-off relations. Now, in complexity, in the literature on complexity, there's often people doing research on that field often talk about maturation. For instance, Dahl, probably he is the most prominent one, talks about the process of maturation, but his approach to maturation is overt oriented. So languages produce more and more fine-grained grammatical categories over time, and that is then what creates complexity, but it creates only overt complexity. What I would like to argue for is that we can find can find a similar type of maturation, but a type of maturation that doesn't lead to overt complexity, as we see it in Dahl's discussion, but a type of complexity that does exactly the other, works exactly the other way, in the sense that it enables a language to be more economic, if needed from context. In many languages in Europe, as in European, but not only European languages, the complexity of the language, as I said, forces you to express all sorts of grammatical concepts. You may also find languages in which allow speakers to be economic, to do away with all these categories if they are not necessary from the perspective of informational content. So my hypothesis too is then there is a second type of maturation that is driven by economy and leads to hidden complexity. So if we look at number 8 on page 5, there is a grammar at a certain state X, and then this grammar is of course subject to change, as all languages are. If explicitness wins, we get into morphosyntax-based maturity, which is overt. So we get into overt complexity. That is the type of process discussed by Dahl. Or on the other hand, if economy wins, then we get into what I call pragmatic space maturity, or hidden complexity. That would then be the result. And now what I would basically do is actually pretty simple in a way, because I would like to present you first of all examples of explicitness-driven maturation in East and Mainland Southeast Asian languages. So we will look first at the explicitness-oriented side that leads to overt complexity, morphosyntax-based complexity, and that will happen in the section 4 of my presentation.
Can I ask
yeah, of course.
a question? On table 2, you have Eastern Mainland Southeast Eastern Asian languages having high overt complexity. Is a high overt complexity. So they force you to code these things.
No. You see, I make hidden complexity can have two meanings. It can have
No, I'm not. I'm talking about a high overt complexity.
Yes, so they have a very fine-grained systems of grammatical distinctions, but they don't need to express them.
So if they express these categories overtly, that means low or high, okay, overt.
Yes, that's what if they.
Which one?
Low.
It's low, right?
Yes, it's I mean, as I said,
if the language does not make, say, present past tense distinction, grammatically, is it high, overt, or low overt?
No, you have to look at the system as it is, not at theoretical distinctions between.
No. For a language like we're talking about Chinese.
Let's assume a language has a distinction between past and non-past.
Yeah.
And
now,
now,
overtly, I mean, semantically, all languages make that distinction. We're talking about coding.
yeah, there are exceptions. There are languages that don't make that distinction lots, but
Semantically?
Yeah, semantically, but I mean, I'm interested in
I
terms.
doubt that, but anyway, that's fine. Now, if the language does not overtly mark present past contrast, for example, grammatically. Does that mean you have, which one is it?
No, that is
overt
not-
complexity is high or low? If the language does not mark,
if there is no such distinction, then there is simply no such distinction.
so that's low overt complexity.
That's low overt complexity, yes.
Then
And
East Asian language has to have low overt complexity, right?
I think he's about to demonstrate some examples of
I
high
want to
overt
discuss-
complexity,
yes,
which are not obligatory,
Yes,
but are nonetheless quite complex
Yes.
and overt.
yes, and overt, that's a distinction. Yes.
Well, let's see them.
But you see, if a language doesn't have, if a language doesn't express, that doesn't have any marker for a certain grammatical distinction,
That
then you
is
can
low,
only say
right?
there is no overt complexity with regard
So
to
it's
that
low
category.
overt complexity.
Yeah.
So I don't know why these East Asian languages have high overt complexity. That's what you say in table 2. They have high overt complexity?
Yes, because they have grammaticalized a lot of categories with fine-grained distinctions.
They do.
Yes.
But they're not overtly expressed, right?
They are not obligatory.
Ah,
You see, if you look again at what I say on page 1, economy, hidden complexity, bottom of the page, then that means does not force the speaker to covertly express grammatical categories. That's one side, so lack of obligatoriness. And on the other hand, another process of inference, because I'm talking about forcing the speakers being, or hearers being forced into pragmatic inference, multifunctional markers. These are the two indicators of high hidden complexity.
so overt complexity, if you have
And
to...
in an overt complex system, you would have a nice system that tells you have the tense, and tense is past, present, or future, different degrees of
overtly marked,
remoteness.
right? Overtly marked.
Always overtly marked. Right?
That's
So-
high overt complexity.
Mhm.
So Chinese does not mark those distinctions.
Yes, but let's look at the examples. I think
Okay.
it will become a lot
I don't get
clearer.
what you're saying.
It's because you have this disjunct definition, right? 1B, a rich inventory of fine-grained grammatical categories can coexist with 2A.
Yes,
You're not forced to express them.
yes.
Okay.
That's it. Is.
So it's both overt complex and hidden complex
Yes. So that
at
is,
the same time.
and the two of them cannot be that easily be distinguished from each other. But given the right situation, and that is what ultimately matters what I call hidden simplicity. The outcome of it, the result, can be a very simple looking surface structure, probably just a verb with a come to have verb. Come to have arrive, or come to have visit. And then the speaker has to infer quite a lot in terms of what come to have as a grammatical marker means. Was it a positive effect? Did he have the ability? Or was it a negative effect? Was he obliged to? It was an obligation to go there. It was not a positive invitation. Did he go there? Past, future. And of course, he also has to infer person and probably all sorts of things. So on the surface, you only have a relatively vague tense aspect marker, which allows a lot of pragmatic inference, and you have the verb, and the rest is not there. And that would be the outcome of a language that allows for a lot of hidden complexity.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, but let's go ahead now and let's look at some examples. First of all, as I said, explicitly driven maturation, as we can find them in East and Southeast Asian languages. Now, of course, there are pronominal, and I will look at pronominal systems. I will look at tense aspect and at classifier systems, which cover grammatical categories as we all know them from our languages as well. So if one looks into Mandarin, we have this classical pronominal system, first, second, third, with singular and plural distinction. A somewhat more complex one in Hmong, a Miao Yao language, spoken in the north of Thailand. Here you have the first, second, third person, and then singular, dual, and plural. So there is even a bit more complexity and fine-grainedness, overt fine-grainedness. If we look into the pronominal system of Khmer, you can find it here under 11. You have, for instance, in the case of first singular, various pronouns distinguished in social status, basically. So Knyom means I, speaker is acting humble or polite. ein speaker is arrogant, or if I am in an intimate situation with a speaker, with a hearer. Atma is the I form that the monks use when they speak among themselves. Tulbonkum is the kind of first person you have to use when you address the king and members of the royal family, and so on and so forth. I could do the same for the second and third person. And as we will see in more detail, there are a lot of kinship terms that can also be used for in pronominal function. That, of course, then introduce yet additional distinctions of belongings and family relationships. So this is very briefly the aspect of person as it is overtly marked, and thus can be seen as an indicator of overt complexity in East and mainland Southeast Asian language. Very briefly, I've given you some examples of Chinese. Of course, if you address these individual markers, like Wacha and Zai, perfective, experiential, durativity, and preverbal, then you can write a book about each of them, and that is what happened. It's still not quite clear or controversial in detail very often what these individual markers actually express, but they are a quite straightforward differentiation of grammatical categories in terms of marking. And in addition to that, the language has developed a system that is called resultative system. You have verb 1 and verb 2, and the second verb expresses a state that can be seen as the result of the first verb. So if you have 14 here, he eat full, he be full, perfective marker in the sense of he has eaten, and as a result he is now full, so he has eaten to his full. That would be a typical construction like that. The Chinese resultative system is extremely elaborate. There are more than 100 verb twos. The productivity varies. For instance, the one I quote in under 14, bao, is limited to eat. There is no other verb that can occur with that. But many others are semi-productive. If you look at the one, that means one, finish, it's almost productive. You can add it to almost any of these verbs. So the resultatives are an important source for further grammaticalization. And I've given you a few markers up for Khmer under 16, but given the time situation, we probably don't need to look at the Khmer examples and pass on immediately to numeral classifier systems. Now, numeral classifier systems are complex in both ways in Chinese and at least many other, not all, but many other East and mainland Southeast Asian languages. They are obligatory very often. And then, since you most of the time have a larger number of classifiers, they also add intricate complexity to the system, because you have to know which noun occurs with which classifier. For instance, under 17, their list is not complete, it's just the most common ones. Under 17, you have animal classifiers, chi, or ko, or to, or wei. For plants, I've given you two. For one-dimensional objects, I've given you two as well, the two most common ones. For two-dimensional flat objects, you have chang, and so on. So these classifiers add to the complexity in the sense that you would have to make this fine-grained distinctions for selecting the right one. Now, as I said, their function is to individuate in the sense that they are used in counting. The nominal concept is, that's the idea, is not individuated when it is in the lexicon. So you have something like chair, but there is no individuation there. So the classifier individuates that concept, and then you can count it on the basis of that. As we will see later, classifiers can also be used to mark definiteness and indefiniteness. So I think numeral classifiers are a good example for providing fine-grained distinctions and thus for producing overt complexity. But what can we now say about the other side, the economy-driven complexity, that is the complexity that is not the result of maturation in Dahl's sense, but the result of maturation that leads to economy. And for that purpose, we will look at section 5, which starts at the end of page 8. And we will look again at pronominal systems. We will look again at tense aspect, but only briefly because I've discussed this elsewhere and earlier. We will look at numeral classifiers, and to add some variation, we will look at a single verb give it and its different meanings. Now if we look at the, in each case we will first look at multifunctionality, which is, as I've said, one side of complexity, and then we will also look at the lack of obligatoriness and see how hidden complexity is expressed in these languages. So let's start with multifunctionality for each of these systems, and then in the next step, the next stage, we will look at lack of obligatoriness. First of all, multifunctionality, 5.1, and then in 5.1.1 we will look at kinship terms as markers of person. So the kinship term can express any person. So if you have, for instance, in 19, mean, aunt, and there is a speaker, the relation between speaker and hearer is either that of an aunt, that is a real kinship term, or also if they are in a certain social situation which does not necessarily imply relatedness, family relatedness, then they can mean either as a noun, auntie goes to the market, or I go to the market, if auntie is talking about herself to her, or I go to the market, you go to the market, if the speaker addresses someone in an aunship relation, and she goes to the market in the third person. We describe what is going on here. Now this is a constructed example. On the 20, I offer you an example from a fairy tale in which where there's a tiger, an old tiger, and a young girl. And the old tiger talks about himself as da, grandfather, meaning I, and he addresses the grandchild, he addresses the young girl by the term ciao, grandchild. So the story begins, Nieng, my girl, and then ta yok ai ban plai chok no. Ta, in the sense of I, grandfather, can take the blade of the spade for you. She lost the blade of the spade and he has to retrieve it for her. And then it goes on, but only if I can get you personally at looking for lysis on my behalf. He is an old tiger and all sorts of health problems, and he hopes the girl to help him. And on line 2 you can see again, printed in bold, that second ta, grandfather, meaning I. On the third line again, ta men bak, I'm not worthy, grandfather is not worthy to take a good deed, ti chao, from grandchild, from you. So then one can see how that game works, and this is not only the case in Khmer but also in Thai and a few other languages of the area. Okay, this is as far as the pronominal system goes. The tense aspect system, I won't address anything else here, but you've seen the examples of come to have verbs. And then we will briefly look into numeral classifiers. And as I've already said, they can be used for individuation, for counting, but they have a second function, which is identification, and that leads ultimately into the marker of definiteness and indefiniteness. What is interesting is, and that is why I quote this example here in terms of multifunctionality, one and the same marker can mean definiteness, but it can also mean indefiniteness. This is probably not what we would expect from an article system like Spanish, that you have the same marker for both functions. In Sinitic languages, that is in various dialects of Chinese, the interpretation of the classifier depends on the position of the construction. So if you have classifier plus noun, and if the classifier plus noun element is in front of the verbs, in the position in front of the verb, it's definite. Most of the time, depends on the individual language, on the system. And if it follows the verb, it is indefinite. And the table 4 is a short summary in Putonghua, that is in standard Chinese, that is normally analyzed. The classifier does not function, the classifier is not a really important definiteness marker, but if it occurs, it occurs in verbal position only, and then it marks minus definite, that is indefinite. In other varieties of Chinese, classifiers are much more prominent. So in Wu Chinese, for instance, it can mark definiteness if it's in front of the verb in the subject position, and it marks indefiniteness if it is in the object position. And in Cantonese, it marks definiteness in front of the verb, and if it is in the postverbal position, it can mark definiteness, but it can also mark indefiniteness, so it is open in that position, what it really means. Looking at the time, I probably don't go into the details with the examples, but example 21 and 22 illustrate what I mean. We probably just look at 22. Here you can see an example from Chinese in 22a. 我买了辆 classifier 车 car. And here, 辆车 in the postverbal position can only mean I bought a car, not the car. In Wu, the same construction, 不错字 classifier car is definite and only definite. In C, from Cantonese, the same construction again, 驾车 means car, but it can mean a car or the car, depending on the position. In other languages, however, the classifier only marks definiteness. That is illustrated by Hmong, where, well, it's the story. It's actually simple. The protagonists are first introduced indefinitely. So long ago, they were a wife and a husband. And then the husband died, so the husband is taken up by classifier plus C, husband. And again, then the wife was crying a lot, classifier wife. And in the end, in the last clause, we found the last two words, 2 C, classifier husband again. But this time it's not in the subject position, but it's in the object position, and it also marks the husband. So as I said, in Hmong, the situation is different. Classifier only marks definiteness. So this might be called, but we will see that this is not quite true when we go on later, an instance of overt complexity, so that we will see these things are not obligatory. In waning Ahmau, we have probably the most complex system one can think of. Well, one can think of more complex ones, but one can encounter. In that language, table 5, the classifier takes different forms. So depending on whether it's definite or indefinite, you get another classifier form. And to make it a bit more complex, the paradigm consists of 6 slots. 3 distinctions have to do with size, so whether the objective is augmentative, medial, or diminutive. For each case, you have a different classifier form for the definite and indefinite, and that yields a 6-way system, which then can also make a distinction between singular and plural, so you get 12 different slots in the whole for the classifier. And to give you an idea of how this looks, I've printed out table 6 for you too, in which you can see that the classifier Lu, 5-5 means high tone level. Lu in the definite form is Lu in the indefinite form, mid-level. For the augmentative form, for the medial form, you have I, namely Lai versus Lai. And for the diminutive, you have La versus La. So A and I are characteristic vowels for medial and diminutive. And you can see that there is a different form for definite and indefinite. That is, of course, on the one side also overt complexity, but we will see in a minute that this is not the whole story, because none of these are obligatory in a strict sense. Well, the last example, but probably given time, we will not go into that, are the different functions of give verbs. One and the same verb can be grammaticalized into an adposition with meaning, with marking benefactives. It can be used as a causative verb, make somebody do something. It can mark an adverbial subordination, either in terms of purpose or in terms of manner. And finally, it can also function as a complementizer. That is the case in Khmer. Now recently I've heard a presentation at the Association of Linguistic Typology this year by Nai, who showed that in one dialect of Min, another large cluster of dialects of Sinitic, of Chinese, that the verb tie, to give, can have even much more functions. It basically does the same as in Khmer, but then it has also the functions of come to have verbs. So it has both of them together. And I didn't print out an example for each of that, but on 32 you can have the summary. So in this language, tie marks benefactive, then it also marks allative and locative. It can mark causativity and purpose, as in Khmer. It can also mark potential and permission, as with the come to have verb in Khmer. It can be a marker of manner. It is also used as an intensifier, very, and it is a sort of passive, Chinese type passive, but it is also used in that function. So I think this is extremely multifunctional. There's always a different construction, so one can see the distinctions if one sees the construction into which the marker is embedded. But I think this is indicative of hidden complexity, in the sense that one and the same marker can really, depending on context, mean. So this was now the multifunctionality side of hidden complexity. We've looked at pronouns. We've briefly looked at the verb come to have again in terms of tense aspect marking. We have looked at classifiers. Sometimes they can express definiteness and indefiniteness. And now let's look briefly at obligatoriness. So I probably don't need to say too much about the radical pro-drop again, because we've seen this example. I've given you another one on the 33 from Hmong. We probably don't even need to read it, but this example is interesting for one particular reason, or Hmong is interesting for one particular reason, because there was, in formal linguistics, there was the idea that one can account for radical pro-drop by looking at the pronominal system. On the 34, you will find the radical pro-drop generalization as suggested by Nelemann and Sendroi 2007. This generalization is extremely simple. Radical pro-drop requires agglutinating morphology and pronouns. And if we look at the pronominal system of Hmong, as I printed it out under 10, you may remember 20 minutes before, that language has the distinction between first, second, third person, singular, dual, plural, and it's hard to see anything like agglutination in this language, but the language still has pro-drop, so the language doesn't seem to care too much about the agglutinative system of its pronominal system. And in fact, also if one looks at earlier stages of Chinese, one can see that there is no necessity of agglutination, and earlier versions of Chinese were also very much radical pro-drop until back to Confucius' time, 2,500 years earlier. Then we've also looked at no overt tense aspect marking. I've just copied you another story from Khmer, in which there's basically only one adumbration to time, so to speak, and that is in the third line, printed in bold as the system allows it to be printed. So prepare, spade, achieve, finish. Achieve, finish in the sense of, after she had. So this is the only adumbration to time in one way or another, and nothing else. Now let's briefly look to numeral classifiers. We've seen that numeral classifiers are characterized by multifunctionality in the case of Semitic. We have also seen that some of the systems are actually also overtly complex, in the sense that they have these distinctions we've seen in waning Ahmao, where there's a distinction between singular, plural, and size. But interestingly enough, even if these markers are fine-grained to a large extent, they are not obligatory. So if one looks at Hmong, for instance, where we've seen that the classifier marks definiteness, up to a certain extent, it is not always marked. Normally when a protagonist is introduced, it will be introduced as an indefinite element with one classifier noun, as in line 1. So Poitou came across a group of wild chicken, marked as indefinite, which run towards him. There was also a leopard on line 2. He took one classifier, pli, leopard. So he, the protagonist, shot at the wild chicken, and the wild chicken in line 3 are marked again by classifier, kai, chicken, ku, wild. Then the story goes on. Then the leopard jumped towards them. So on line 4, ma, tu, pli, then the leopard jumped towards them, again with classifier. But after that, the leopard is mentioned twice again on line 5 and 6. Everybody knows that the leopard is definite. We know we can identify it easily, so it's no longer necessary to mark it by a classifier. So on line 5 you see pli, leopard. Pli is clearly definite, as I said, but there is no classifier, no nothing marking its definiteness. So one and the same bare noun can be used to mark definiteness sometimes, as in this case, sometimes indefiniteness one has to. The same applies plus minus in waning ahmao. Here the obligatoriness is somewhat more extensive, so animal nouns and concepts that are foregrounded in discourse tend to use obligatorily with a classifier, but less important backgrounded elements, they remain unmarked. So there is a certain realm in which definiteness is not marked, is not obligatory to be marked. So let me wrap up what I've tried to say. Conclusion is, I hope that I was somehow able to show that there are two different types of complexity. Explicitness, one as we know it from the general discussion, and the hidden complexity, which is based on autonomy. And then the hypothesis one was that there is no trade-off relation between the two types of complexity. The example of East and Mainland Southeast Asia languages discussed in the two previous sections show that both types can develop to a high degree of overt complexity plus high degree of hidden complexity. We've looked at overt complexity with, as we've seen it in pronominal systems, tense aspect systems, and numeral classifier systems. And then we've looked at the same systems from the perspective of hidden complexity, and we've seen that pronominal systems are hiddenly complex in the sense that if we look at kinship terms, for instance, and of course they are not obligatory. Tense aspect systems similarly are not obligatory, and they sometimes can have very vast interpretational range, ranging from possibility to necessity to factility and past. And numeral markers that can mark definiteness and indefiniteness, and even if they mark definiteness, even if there is a morphological system that distinguishes them, they don't seem to be obligatory to the same extent as we would expect it in our languages. So in that sense, I think one can show that the two forces, the two competing motivations, lead into two different types of complexity, two different types of maturation, and that leads to hypothesis 2. Hidden complexity is another type of maturation in addition to overt maturations, in the sense that the markers we've discussed so far are the result of processes of grammaticalization. If one looks at the whole complex linguistic situation in this area, because there are no less than 5 different families, namely Sinitic, Chinese, Thai Kadai with languages like Thai and many others, Mon Khmer with Mon and Khmer and Vietnamese, Hmong Mien, and to a smaller extent also Chamic, one sub-branch of Austronesian. And they all converged in one way or another through highly complex interactions of contact. I've tried to describe that in my course in some more detail. So in addition to language internal structures that trigger processes of grammaticalization, there's also an additional story of intensive contact in all different ways. What is interesting is that in these languages, the grammar allows languages to be more hiddenly complex than, let's say, contact languages as Creole and so on, in which we have all these restrictions that I've tried to show. And it's probably also time that I try to stop. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Walter. Abrimos espacio para preguntas, comentarios.
Sí.
Okay. A mí me parece interesante esta idea de complejidad, no sé, escondida y explícita. Ok, pero me parece que este es como varios otros procesos o tipos de complejidad en lenguas. Es más una descripción de construcciones en vez de una descripción de lenguas, propiamente dicho.
Sí, claro. Hay esa distinción entre, digamos, la complejidad global. Podemos decir que el lengua X es más complejo que el lengua Y. Y esto normalmente no funciona porque siempre tienes que haber un sistema de referencia para de verdad evaluar y asesorar la complejidad. No tenemos la capacidad de mesurar, de medir la complejidad de idiomas.
Pues entonces sería posible también distinguir siempre entre la diferencia de elaboración, grado de elaboración y grado de obligatoriedad.
Sí, en este senso se trata de crear, digamos, un cuestionario o un espacio semántico en este senso con varias distinciones más o menos finos y elaboradas. Y después se puede ver hasta qué grado hay inferencia en en marcadores individuales y claro que sí, al otro lado, la obligatoriedad de este marcador, digamos, en el caso de la...
Y en este sentido, tabla 2 sería, para mí por lo menos, más claro, con elaboración de un lado y obligatoriedad en el otro lado, en vez de complejidad como explícita y escondida.
Sí, pero el problema es que confluyen, que convergen en estos idiomas.
Sí, pero a veces no.
A veces no.
Sí.
Sí, tienes razón. Ajá.
Por ejemplo, en términos de los pronombres, hay elaboración grande de Hmong y obligatoriedad no, entonces bajo. Pero hay sistemas con complejidad alta y obligatoriedad alta, como Nepali o las lenguas índicas. Y también hay lenguas que tienen complejidad baja y obligatoriedad baja, en términos de un sistema, como pronombres o algo así. Entonces, construcción por construcción, no es siempre el caso que complejidad combinan los dos trazos, los dos rasgos.
No lo combinan, pero lo que estaba interesante para mí es que en estos idiomitas que estudia yo, es así, pero tienes razón. Tienes razón.
Pues.
¿Otro comentario? ¿Otro?
Igual me parece, me gusta mucho esta idea de complejidad escondida, ¿no? Pero, bueno, tengo dos preguntas. Una, ¿en qué se diferencia de la vieja idea de criptotipo? Es, me imagino, muy similar, ¿no? Criptotipo. Que yo creo que es justamente este tipo de fenómenos. Cuando hay distinciones en una lengua que no son explícitas, pero que hay contextos que permiten decir que en efecto existe esa distinción.
Yo no conozco ese concepto de criptotípica, pero lo que dices tú en este caso me parece ser algo diferente, porque no se trata de, digamos, distinciones semánticas que siempre se pueden hacer en cada idioma. Podemos decir que, por ejemplo, en castellano no hay hidden complexity en la evidencialidad.
Sí, no digo, en términos de cada lengua. ¿No?
Sí.
Sí, porque digo, si no tampoco en inglés no hay, digamos, complejidad oculta en términos de género, ¿no?
Sí, sí.
Bueno, pero y la otra es, hay últimamente algunas teorías semánticas que dicen que la ambigüedad, digamos como que anteriormente la ambigüedad se tenía que resolver en algún punto semánticamente antes de interpretar una oración, ¿no? O sea, si uno tiene, digamos, casos de ambigüedad por cuantificadores, por ejemplo, ¿no? Cada estudiante leyó un libro, muchas personas piensan que hay que distinguir los dos significados para poder interpretar la oración. Pero hay ahora nuevas teorías que dicen que no, que eso no se tiene que resolver para interpretar la oración. Y lo que yo me estoy preguntando es si la idea de complejidad oculta es justamente que los hablantes tienen que resolverlo para poder interpretar la oración, o bien que pueden pasar varias oraciones sin necesidad de resolverlo, sí, hasta que es absolutamente necesario, sí, resolverlo.
Y en mi opinión es la segunda versión.
Okay.
Y por varias razones, y desearíamos hacer estudios también en este caso, porque quizás si ofrecemos una estructura bastante sencilla a informadores, y después se puede ver quizás en un experimento como se dice en el neurológico, se puede decir que hay diferentes efectos. Quizás presentas un cierto ejemplo en un cierto contexto que solamente implica una sola interpretación, y quizás ahí después se puede ver algo en relación al tipo de inferencia que tiene que hacer el interlocutor. Yo creo que tienes razón. Normalmente los locutores no se dan cuenta de que había 2 o 3 o 4 interpretaciones diferentes. El par ser humano tiene que decidirse inmediatamente, esto es la significativa, pero el sistema gramatical es más abierto, en el senso de que de una manera más abstracta se puede decir, esta estructura tiene 4 interpretaciones posibles, y puedes construir contextos que al fin y al cabo producen estos 4 tipos de interpretación, pero claro, solamente una interpretación para cada uno tipo de contexto.
¿Hay alguna tendencia, por ejemplo, en las lenguas no concatenativas o no lineales, para que tanto la complejidad oculta o la complejidad evidente se muestre con mayor, digamos, claridad que en una lengua que no lo sea? O sea, que una lengua que no manifieste morfología concatenativa, sino que, pues, digamos, sea una lengua aglutinante, por ejemplo.
Sí, hay una cierta correlación, pero al otro lado no es siempre así. Hay idiomas en los cuales la expresión del tiempo, la expresión del número, la expresión de todas estas categorías es sintáctica. Tienes una palabra diferente que toma ciertas posiciones. En este senso, la distinción entre, digamos, tipología morfológica y complejidad no funciona por 100%. Hay una cierta correlación que se observa también, digamos, en contacto lingüístico, en el senso de que fenómenos sintácticos o más altas en la estructura, en el sistema gramatical son borrowed más fácilmente, pero al otro lado no siempre funciona. En este senso la correlación no está, como digo, 100%.
¿Otro comentario? ¿Pregunta? ¿Sí, Marco?
I know, I understand how to look at table too. The problem here is for East Asian languages, you have all languages in this slot, say one of the slots. Whereas for languages like English and Italian and Mandarin, you have only specific constructions that are
that's what
put into cells, right? So English may have high hidden complexity too, in some aspect.
Yeah.
So So that's a bit confusing, right? So whether the whole languages can have all these things, whether it makes more sense to say that in this area, in this system, it has high complexity in one way or the other, right? Rather than
yeah, doing this entirely in
No, but that is what I said at the outset, that I want to have it's quite clear that it's not we are not talking about global complexity, but we are talking about grammatical domains.
specific local, yeah,
Yes,
domain,
of
right?
course.
Yeah.
And then you can look at plural or whatever, and you see, yeah, or the marking of definiteness, for instance, and you
Yeah.
can see how this works in
My
individual.
second question is whether there is some tendency for some languages to elaborate more on the nominal dimension than the verbal dimension.
Of course.
That's probably kind of impression that I get, comparing East Asian languages that seem to make fine-grained distinction with nominal references, whereas verbally we are rather poor, I think, compared to European languages, where they seem to elaborate more on the verbal. Combination of tense and aspect, for example, that we don't do very well in Southeast Asian languages.
It is very interesting because, on the other hand, there is this paper by Liu Danqing, who in Yu and Yinqiu, who recently argued that the Chinese is a predicate, a verb-oriented language rather than a nominal-oriented.
It depends on what it means.
It depends on what he means, and I have also
yes,
some questions what he actually means in this context, but
Yeah.
he has some good evidence. But I'm not so sure. I mean, in all these languages, I think one has to make a distinction between two degrees. On the one hand, you have these highly grammaticalized markers like Kuo. These are only the last steps, and then you have these resultative constructions, for instance, which can be extremely rapid. And if there is a recent paper showing this very nicely. If one looks at Chinese texts, you don't have le or zhe very often, but what you find is you have a sort of Aktionsart that is expressed by this resultative construction, be it verb 1 with verb 2, and very often this seems to be enough if you juxtapose two actions just by marking them with a slightly more lexical procedure. So it is not necessary to then mark in addition that le, to use that le thing. And that is used consistently in discourse. So for that reason, I think the system is more complex in terms of the lexical side of it, and I think that the resultative construction part has a lexical side to it, and that is much more elaborate, makes it hard for learners because you have to learn all these 100 verbs or combinations. But then you don't always have to use the very clear-cut perfective and imperfective markers which you can find in the language. So, yeah, and this lexical side is developed up to a certain part, but leaves the reader the freedom of not marking other categories. And this is also, on the one hand, an aspect of historical development, of maturation. You see how this developed from the 2nd century AD onwards. So there are lots of texts from which one can see how it began, and how from that system actually at least 3 or 4 subsystems developed. The directional system, come and go, and so on, is developed from it, and many others. And yeah, as I said, that can then be seen as a historical process, but it doesn't lead into what we would expect, that is, into a fully fledged, obligatory kind of paradigm as we have it. And I've also some ideas of for why the languages don't develop morphological paradigms and can live happily without them.
¿Otra pregunta o comentario? No, pues agrega. ¿Sí? ¿Ibas a decir algo?
Solamente más una pregunta sobre los cambios históricos y maduración. No, hay 2 tipos de maduración aquí también, como 2 tipos de complejidad escondidos, ¿no? Uno sería la elaboración de sistemas, como el sistema pronominal en Hmong, que parece el tipo de fluorescence, como dice Chef, que es el resultado de procesos de gramaticalización típico. Y el otro, que es totalmente diferente y no entiendo todavía, es cómo es que se desarrollan estos sistemas no obligatorios o la falta de obligatoriedad. ¿Este es un proceso como gramaticalización unidireccional o este es algo un poco más
Sí, sí. Lo que yo desearía decir es que hay diferentes procesos de gramaticalización en diferentes áreas lingüísticas también. Me parece que lo que discuten, por ejemplo, Jaime Kuteva, etcétera, funciona perfectamente con muchos idiomas, pero no con todos. Y me interesaría también si hay otras áreas lingüísticas en las cuales hay gramaticalización con ciertos productos, claro que sí, pero que se distinguen de lo que se puede observar, digamos, en Standard Average European, quizás. No solamente, por ejemplo, este tipo de come to have verbs que se gramaticaliza en un marcador de modalidad. Es típico para la área de los idiomas del Extremo Oriente. Pero no conozco en ningún otro lado del mundo, rincón del mundo, en el cual se había desarrollado este verbo en esta dirección. Y en este senso, quizás no hay solamente desarrollos específicos de marcadores individuales, pero también más generalmente una gramaticalización más hidden oriented, una gramaticalización más overt oriented con subclases o con variaciones en idiomas individuales. Y es esto el segundo lado de mi investigación, de ver si quizás tendríamos que aceptar que la gramaticalización no es algo tan homogéneo como parecía a veces. ¿Sí?
Y para la interpretación tenemos que estudiar psicoanálisis. Bueno, a ver qué quiere recibir.
Psicoanálisis, no, al menos sí. Claro que estos experimentos neurológicos tienen sus límites, bastante ¿cómo se dice?, bastante crudos en un cierto modo, pero se pueden ver ciertas cosas y ciertos efectos que parecen que se establecen. Es decir, pero en ese senso no es necesario entender todos los detalles de los conocimientos de personas individuales, pero al fin y al cabo, a veces tienes que saber mucho sobre contexto, manera de vivir, cultura, interpretación, pero me parece que las categorías de las cuales se trata aquí son algo más abstractos. Entonces, no es necesario conocer todos los detalles de lo que piensa una persona. No necesitamos la NS para analizar todo esto.
Muy bien, pues creo que...
Gracias.
Gracias, Walter.